Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Gagasan Mahasiswa Undang-Undang Sabah's very own webinar series introducing legal perspectives from Sabahan advocates, where we'll be looking into the basics of native law, its unique position in Sabah's legal system, and how it governs the customs and practices of the natives. I'm Amber, your host for today, and together with me is my co-host Afini, who will be also moderating the Q&A session with the audience later on. Before we move on, I'd like to invite Brenda, the Director of Academic Relations, as well as the person in charge of this event, to give a short speech. Sorry, Brenda, I think you were muted just now. Would you like to say your speech again?
Oh, I am so sorry for that. Okay, I apologize to everyone. Okay, I'll just say it again. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brenda. So, as mentioned by my colleague Amber, I've been the person organizing this webinar series behind the scenes with much teamwork involved. And I'm proud to see it coming into action. How this event came about was that I initially thought that Sabahan lawyers have not been provided much exposure when it comes to sharing their legal knowledge or experience in webinars and talks. So, being a society serving the interests of Sabahan law students, this was one of our aims, namely to connect our members or students with Sabahan lawyers. Just with this idea, it actually sparked a chain of discussions with some of my team members. And there was a whole lot of planning and brainstorming together on what topics were suitable and unique to the Sabahan legal landscape. So, with that said, I truly hope that every one of you here who are present today will have great takeaways from each of the sessions that we have lined up just for you. Thank you for your time and do enjoy the sessions. I will pass the time back to Amber.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I now invite my co-host Afini to list down some ground rules for the session today.
Hi, hello everybody. I'm Afini, your co-host for today. Nice meeting you all. Now I'll be listing down all the ground rules here. So today's session comprises of two parts. The first session will be for 1 hour between the moderators and the speakers. The second session will be a Q&A session for approximately 30 to 35 minutes between all of you and our speaker today. All questions from the audience will only be taken and answered by our speaker after the first session. So feel free to type in your questions in the chat box along the session or during the Q&A session with me later on. Also, please be mindful and respectful of all your questions directed to the speakers and your comments regarding the sessions. And in the meantime, let's just sit back, relax, and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Afini. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our esteemed speaker of the day. We have none other than Mr. Jubili Anilik, a litigation lawyer with experience in various areas of law, such as family disputes, matrimonial disputes, probate law, just to name a few. More notably, he is an advocate for native rights and customary law jurisprudence. Without further ado, we will kickstart our session with 3 basic questions about native law, and later on, Mr. Jubili will present some slides regarding the native court system. Hi, Mr. Jubili, how are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing fine.
Are you okay if we just start off the session?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so first question for you. Who is a native in Sabah?
That's an interesting question. We have a law, we have the interpretation, uh, the definition of a native in that law, it's state legislation. The problem is, it just says this, tau. A native is someone whose both parents are people who are indigenous in Sabah. That's the first criteria. And the second criteria is a, a certification from the native court that the person is a native, and also that the person fulfills certain criteria. So we actually have two things. One, you are automatically a native if both your parents are indigenous people of Sabah, and two, you're a native if you fulfill certain criteria and the native court gives you a certificate that you're a native. It's the second criteria isn't so important right now. You can check it. You can get a copy of the ordinance from our state attorney general chamber website. You can just Google it. The problem with that second criteria is that there is a freezing order by the state government on the native court from issuing that certificate. We have not had a new native certificate for the last 20 years because there was a lot of uh, impropriety lah. I think corruption, like some people paid the native court to give them that certificate. So because being a native gives you a lot of advantages, I think, here in Sabah. So that's the second definition. The other one, both parents who are indigenous peoples of Sabah. Here's the problem. Who's an indigenous person of Sabah? We don't have a definition here. There were talks about listing out the definition of indigenous people in Sabah. But it collapsed because everyone wanted to be on the list, and if you forgot somebody, then it's a political offense, and then it never materialized lah. So that's that, sadly. Okay.
I see. Okay. So,
Yeah.
next question would be, in your personal experience of handling native customary law cases, who are the most common ethnic groups involved?
Oh, okay. So that's a really hard question because I'm from Penampang and my district is a Kadazan majority district. So the people I meet are usually Kadazans or Dusuns. I've not had the opportunity to advise a Murut, Rungus, Sungai uh, client lah. Mm. If you were in, let's say, Keningau, that'd be a mixed bag, I think. You'll be meeting a bunch more. And if you're in the north, maybe in Kudat, you'll be meeting a lot more Rungus clients. Keningau lah, the heartlands lah, pedalaman, Tongodka maybe. Then you get a mix of all kinds of ethnicities.
I
But
see.
they all have
So,
to be natives lah. Mm-mm.
yeah. So it kind of depends on the area, right? Okay.
So I have one question before we start the show. what are some of the statutes that we usually refer to in native law practice?
Okay, nice. So that's the basic question lah. Hello, law students. So we've got one important enactment, the Native Court Enactment 1990. I don't know, 94, 92. I can check it up later. It's in my slides. That's the first one you need to check. That statute provides the constitution of the native courts. It gives you the jurisdiction. It gives you all the things you need to know about the native court's power. And from that enactment, you've got subsidiary registration. You've got the rules. It will tell you which forms. And there's one particular subsidiary legislation that's really important. It's called the uh, I think, let me check. There's one that says something about native customs. Here it is. Native customary laws. So native courts, 1992, native customary laws, 1995. That's a subsidiary legislation. So that will give you a list of adat that will give you or things that you can bring to the native court. Unfortunately, that subsidiary legislation pulls a lot from uh, kadazan dusun adat, so it doesn't work for Murut people or Sungai people, for example. But that subsidiary legislation has a clause at the end that gives the native court the jurisdiction to just ignore that list and go based on the adat of the person in the court.
I see.
Okay.
Okay. So now we'll get to the more technical side of things, I think. Mr. Jubili, would you like to present your slides?
Yes, please.
All right.
Oh, Brenda, yeah, is sharing it. Okay, so I thought this would be an easier thing to do lah, just to give a rundown on how the native courts work, because as you've just listened just now, if you don't have background, it's really confusing. So next slide. So I plan on just giving a brief introduction on about the native court, about who, what, when, why, how. Next slide. So what are the native courts? It's a court. It's a court that deals with customs and traditions of natives in Sabah. It's a separate court from the civil and Sharia court. Think of it like the industrial court. It's like a tribunal that deals with a specific set of issues. It's non-religious. It does not care if the native has any religious backing or whatever, except if the native is a Muslim. Then unless that issue is not covered by the Sharia courts, it's okay. So even if the native is Muslim, but it's an issue about uh, boundaries in the kampung, they can still go. So it has no issue. Uh, but it's also not secular. You've got to think about this, because some of the decisions and the orders the native court can give have, I guess, metaphysical connotations, like Sogit. Our Sabahan students might have heard of the term lah. So it's like a spiritual component. Supposed to be, it's like I wrote there to heal the community, but it's also like restitution. But it has a lot. has that element lah. Next slides. So who goes to the native court? The native court only deals with natives. We spoke just now with Amber about who a native is. Those two people, those who have both parents who are indigenous people of Sabah, or somebody who has a certificate, and for uh, a very limited sense, a native and a non-native, with the permission of the district officer. The district officer, the pegawai daerah, has to give permission, and only for issues relating to marriage, family law. Next slide. Oh, okay. So these are the ones I just mentioned just now. Who is a native? It's either number one or number two lah. Okay. Next slide. So who makes a decision? Who is the arbitrator of the native court? So you've got three roles. You've got the district chief, the ketua daerah, as the highest in that area. You've got native chiefs. They are called ketua anak negris, and you've got the ketua kampung. Despite some might thinking that the ketua kampung are minor roles, they are actually part of the native court. They stand as assessors. So if a native chief is presiding over a case, the native chief has to have two ketua kampungs side by side, giving them opinions as advisors. Yeah, next. So who represents you in native court? Uh, you. You represent yourself in the native court at all levels. You are not allowed to be represented by a lawyer at all levels except the final level of the native court, the native court of appeal. It has three levels. Lawyers are not allowed to represent clients there. You cannot appear, but you are allowed to give advice. You are allowed to help your clients write letters, file the necessary forms, make sure the court is presiding in a fair manner as provided by the law. That as a person who receives a client, unless you're a native court of appeal advocate, this is your role lah. You're an advisor and you're a consultant. How do you become a native court of appeal advocate? There is a board, there is a majlis. You have to be inducted. You have to be called to the native court of appeal bar. That's the best analogy lah. But unfortunately, it's been 4 years since the last call to the bar, last induction. I myself am not a native court of appeal advocate yet. I didn't get a chance to get called to the bar. There's an interview, you know. You get interviewed by the panel, and they'll ask you all kind of things, like adat stuff. They'll ask you about your ethnicity first, and then they'll start quizzing you about your knowledge of your own adat. So you've got to be a bit more confident about it lah. Being able to speak your mother tongue helps a lot, especially if you get a panel who has the same ethnicity as you, and they start asking you questions in your own language, and well, if you freeze up, you don't give a good impression lah. But that's that. Yeah. Okay, next slide. So, what goes to native courts? If you check the native courts enactment, they have a lot of jurisdiction actually. Among them, adoptions, family matters usually. You also get all kinds of normal things lah, but like insults. I can give you a bit more examples later, but as long as it involves customs, adat. Once it has adat involved, you can go to the native court. Next. What cannot go to the native court? Anything under the jurisdiction of the civil courts and the Sharia courts, with an exception. For example, criminal matters. If you punch somebody because you were drunk at a wedding, that's what? That's civil battery. That's also a criminal offense, and that is also an adat offense. You can be dragged to either of those avenues. So there's an overlap. But certain things like murder, for example, will not be tried or heard by the native court. You'll be going to the criminal courts. Anything related to Islamic Sharia law, inheritance, faraid, definitely not. Anything related to executive action, government matters lah. I wrote there government matters like tamu licenses. For our Sabahan friends, I'm sure you know what a tamu is. It's an open marketplace. Even though it has a lot of adat at the tamu, the license is not considered part of the native court. It's a district council, pejabat daerah matter. And commercial matters as well. If you are going to enforce a contract, don't go to the native court lah. Yeah. Next slide. Okay, so these are the examples of stuff that you will see in the native court. So when do you go to the native court? There are a lot of situations, but I broke it down to 4 categories. When there's a birth, during your daily living, marriage, and death. Next slide. So when I say birth, I give you these examples. Adoption. Native adoptions are recognized under law. We have the adoption rules for adoptions, so but only among natives and native children lah. Maybe there's a breach of customary abstention, pantang lah. Maybe a mother can't do this and that, and I think maybe a neighbor takes offense, then they can go to native court to get some sort of decision, ruling, or directive to the mother. There's also the issue of native status, especially for those who have one native parent. If you are the child of one native parent and one non-native parent, you're technically a native, but you need the verification because the law says so lah. So those are the things you can go to the native court, as well as for that native certificate that I mentioned just now. The problem is the native certificate has been frozen at the moment. I have not heard any directive from the state government that has reinstated issuance of native certificates. Next slide. Okay, so how about daily living? So you got promises, insults, threats, mostly gossip lah, defamation. You talk bad about your neighbor lah, or they are this and that lah. Then they bring each other to native court. Oh, siap punya, my neighbor called me some lazy person, I feel insulted, and then the other person denies it, and then the whole kampung goes crazy. That kind of stuff lah. Indecency as well. I remember hearing about a case like in the 80s in my district about a nudist, a flasher, a guy that goes around with a coat and like does that and then shows them your private part. That one kena saman, kena sent to native court. Um, Disruption of parties, functions, majlis. You're not invited, but you go there and gate crash. There's a funeral, and then you turn up there drunk and you start kicking people, kick the coffin fall down. That kind of stuff lah. That goes to the native court. We also have certain bits on about working life environment, pollution. Uh, we have very strict adat about polluting communal water sources. That one, trespass to other people's fields. You can have that. Maybe you go and potong diorang punya pokok, all that stuff, or you steal their durians. That one lah. All those things, as well as livestock. Maybe you telanggar, you langgar kerbau. And that kerbau punya owner can drag you to native court lah. Things like that. Yeah, next. Marriage is part of daily living, but I put it as a separate function or separate category because it's so big. There's a ton. First thing first, Sabahan lawyers. Here's the thing. Native marriages are valid under legislation as well as common law in Sabah. Please, please, please do not advise Sabahan clients that only marriages in JPN are recognized. Okay, it's really embarrassing to hear that, especially when you go onto panels and then people ask you and then you say, oh yeah, it's not registered in JPN. They're natives, but not registered, not valid. It's beyond wrong, okay, and it's really embarrassing. They are valid. So is the divorce and other things. Also, the native court, if the adat allows for polygamy, then you can kawin banyak lah, more than Muslims actually. If you're a Muslim, can kawin empat only, right? If you're in that particular ethnic, can kawin banyak lah. That thing lah. But there's other things lah. It's not without consequence about the kawin banyak thing, but there is consequences. Enticement, trying to get entice another person's partner, itu boleh kena juga, that kind of stuff. And incest lah. Incest is also a very heavy adat thing that is really not allowed, that kind of stuff. Next slide. Finally, death, when you die. Your family lah, not you, you'd be dead, will go to the native court if you're native to urus all your inheritance. Also regarding burial grounds, if you're kampung, if you live in a village and you have a communal burial ground, the size of your lot as well as where you are located in that burial ground is a native court matter. As well as the adat barkabung, we call them, the prohibited acts of a widow or widower during a certain time, the mourning period. There are certain ethnics which look at the mourning period really seriously. You can say it's superstition or not lah, but it's under the native court to enforce those prohibitions. Here's an example. If you are going or you go to a funeral, you are not allowed to then go to a wedding. Okay, so if you're visiting Sabahan friends who are not native, or maybe who are native, if you go to a funeral, don't go straight to a wedding. It's a huge insult and it's a huge adat adat, not offense lah, but it's a pelanggaran lah. Yeah, so those are the things that can drag you to the native court. Okay, next. So why would you go to the native court lah if you're a native? One is that lah, it's valid in law. The orders that they give are valid. It's cheap. It's cheaper. You got no lawyers to charge you representation fees. It's also less complicated. Think of the native court similar to the court of equity in England dulu. There's a lot of flexibility in the rules to ensure fair play and to make sure that everyone has a voice, all those things lah. And if you want to practice your adat, why not? If you're going to get married, if both of you and your partner is native, you can either get a registration in JPN under the Law Reform Marriage and Divorce Act, or get a native marriage verification at the native court. It depends on you. It's a choice, actually. Next. So here's the thing. Why are native court decisions valid in law? Well, constitutionally, law has the word custom in it. So customs having force of law in the federation, that's your constitutional answer to it lah. Why adat is valid law. When you talk about force of law, you either mean the adat is recognized through statute. So you've got the Native Courts Enactment, which provides for the original jurisdiction of native courts to make those adat law, or you've got case law, common law cases from the civil court declaring that that particular custom is a valid custom, such and such like that lah. Like this case, Nancy Kual and Ho Taon. It's a famous case actually about marriage between a native and a non-native actually. Yeah. So those are the things. We also have specific legislation. For example, I put an example there, the Administration of Native and Small Estates Ordinance. So if you're dealing with interstate matters, probate matters regarding native estates, you have to look at that particular law. Things like that lah. Yeah. Next. So how is a native court structured? As I mentioned before, there is a native court of appeal. We are actually a 3-tier court. We've got the native court, we've got the district native court, and then we've got the native court of appeal. Now look at the native court of appeal. There's an interesting bit there where a judge of the high court, the civil high court, sits as one of the panels. This goes into this point about the native court being a subsidiary or inferior tribunal lah. Next. Yeah, so how does the native court function? There is hearings and there are trials. Hearings normally with regard to native adoptions. Yeah, I've attended an adoption once as a not as an advocate lah, not as a lawyer, but as a witness for the adoption. So there was only one native chief there. There was no panel. I've also observed the trial where you have the full quorum, the 3 people. That's a trial. The native court has powers, just like the civil court, to compel attendance, production of documents, and even contempt of court. They can contempt you, but if the contempt order has a provision, they can jail you lah, basically throw you to jail for contempt. But that requires an endorsement from a magistrate. Okay, next. So this is how you go. It's basically an appeal system lah. If you're at the native court, you can appeal to district court and finally to the native court of appeal. And of course, they have the power to contempt you. Here's the maximum: 2 years imprisonment or a fine of 5,000. It's normal. Most contempts are normally fines lah. And not lah sampai 5,000 begitu, like few hundred. Mostly after the contempt order, most people follow lah. I have yet to hear or experience a client who is facing a contempt order to go to jail. Not yet. But I know they do happen. There was one famous one in the 90s. Next. Yeah, so it goes back to this. Now, how about judicial review? Since you've got the 3 tiers of appeal, can you still judicial review the native court? Yes, you can. If you've noticed, the civil court has a lot of supervisory and even appellate roles in the native court. If you notice, the native court of appeal has a judge, a civil judge. It doesn't have to be a native now, who sits there. Normally it's a native, but I've checked the past lists of judges. There have been judges who were not natives who sat at the native court of appeal. I'm not sure how that worked, but I guess they depend on the 2 native chiefs or district chiefs to advise them lah. But it places the native court at a inferior or subordinate level. So think of them like the industrial court. The rules of judicial review apply on them, impropriety, illegality, all that kind of stuff lah. But whether or not you should finish the 3 tiers of appeal before going to judicial review is something that you have to check yourself lah. There are case law to tell you when you should exhaust your the local procedure before going to the high court, things like that. Okay, that should be the last one lah. Next. Oh, and habis. Thank you, Kotawa dan. Next, so there's a list of relevant laws that you should check, just for fun or if you're curious. The Native Courts of Enactment, the Administration of Native and Small Estates Ordinance, that adoption regulation thing, the Declaration of Native thing, and the most interesting one is the Native Customary Law Rules lah. That's where you get all kinds of examples of what kind of adat you might face, and you might have to advise your clients. So that's my presentation on the native court. Thank you. So let's continue with questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jubili. I just want to say that's a very interesting and insightful presentation. Like, I personally only learned a bit of native customary law about marriage during my family law in year 1, I think. Like the Nancy Kwal case that you mentioned, I think it was about a tea ceremony or something like that, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's super famous, that case. I've met Nancy Kwal.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, she's still around. She's
wow.
cool.
Okay. Yeah, but I feel like as a Sabahan, it's a bit sad that especially because we're studying law in West Malaysia, right? So we don't really touch a lot on native customary laws in our syllabus, so it's very refreshing to hear about it in this webinar. I have a few questions for you, actually, Mr. Jubili, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah, so the civil court judge sitting in the native court, right? Are there any contentions to that, or is it like a controversial topic? Does it affect the outcome of a case?
Here's the thing, Tao. Uh, the, this native court, being a subordinate court, is controlled by the executive functions. Tao. So, because it's a political thing, they've been very careful in who the High Court judge uh, gets to that level. It's actually a product of our old British heritage. It used to be that the High Court judge that sits there would be this British dude who would, in his wisdom, help the natives resolve their issues, you know. So we haven't got done away with that. I do believe that we should uh, put stricter requirements on who the High Court judge should be. I would say there should be at least a native with some sort of criteria, but at the moment there's not. And there's not really a lot of contention as well because the past High Court judges sitting at the Native Court of Appeal were good people and they were natives, so people didn't complain lah.
Okay, I see. Yeah, I agree with you also about the requirements.
Kan?
Okay, so to our next few questions, the first one would be, does the doctrine of judicial precedent still apply in the native courts, such as when the higher court's decision binds the lower courts in the native court system?
No, there is no precedent in native court. Each court works as a case-to-case basis. The only precedent maybe would be the adat itself. So if the adat says, well, actually, not even the adat. The adat might say, if you breach this adat, you you will be fined or punished. But the amount of punishment might have an element of equity to it. So that's that lah. But there's no precedent. All former cases are guides. They don't bind. And it helps that there are no lawyers lah in the first two levels of the native court. So it's supposed to be a court of equity actually, where the native court tries to find the best solution for both parties.
I
Next.
see, okay. Because I thought like judicial precedent just applies to every court that we have. Okay.
Nope.
Thank you for your answer.
Mr. Jubili, I actually have a questions on that. You mentioned that we don't have any precedent in native law cases, right? So what if, okay, let's say one day I want to become a native law lawyer in the Court of Appeal, let's say, okay, just imagine that. And then how am I going to draft a powerful submission when we don't have any precedents?
Ha. You won't be able to draft a good submission lah. Your case would be based on the facts. It will be purely fact based, and if the adat is in your favor, or even if the adat is not in your favor, you have to go based on the what do we law students used to do that? You know, we have that one particular argument where we can't find any cases supporting us, so we just go by fairness. Yeah, because the adat, let's say a divorce, maybe there's an ethnic that says if the wife asks for a divorce, she has to give back the berian or certain amount. So, but the wife is your client. Your wife is destitute. The wife is destitute, has no property left. Maybe because the husband is useless, a drunkard, a gambler, which is not that rare. Uh, so the adat is against you. As the wife, you have to return the berian, but it's unfair because probably the wife wants to end the marriage because the husband's so useless. And because of the husband, there's no berian left to give back, you see? You don't lose just because of that, just because the adat is against you. You have to make your case to the native court to argue the fairness of the situation, and probably it will work lah. Sorry, it's a bit shaky lah, that section of the law.
Understood. So, if you don't mind sharing with us any interesting cases that you've handled, or any trials that seems interesting that we might need to, have any insight on them.
Here's one. This, because I'm not a native court of appeal advocate, so I've never represented a client, but I have advised a client lah. So imagine this. This is for dusuns in the Tambunan district lah. This is the adat. So a man has 2 wives. The second wife was the first wife passes away, so the man marries the second wife. The man has children from both wives. The man passes away. The second wife wants to claim all of the deceased husband's property lah as the inheritor. The first wife punya children also wants to claim some property from the dead. Based on the adat, the children of the first wife has claim over property that was accrued during the marriage of the deceased with the first wife, but none of the property after the marriage with the second wife. So we call it harta sepencarian lah. Things like that. So that's one case that you will be meeting a lot if you come back here. They'll go to you and say, Puan Paguam, my stepmother wants to get all of my father's land or something like that. So that's the stuff you have to think lah. But the first question in any client in native court is, so what's your ethnicity, ah? Because I'm a Kadazan and I'm familiar with Dusun adat, but talk to me about Murut adat and I'm screwed. I'm doomed. I have no idea how Murut adat works. At least rungus a bit lah and a bit of the sungai, but Murut is way complicated for me because I didn't grow up in that environment. So you probably need to start calling your other friends to speak with their grandmothers
Mayday.
or their aunties or their uncles or their grandpas. Yeah, things like that. Okay. I hope that answers your question.
We need a lot of knowledge if we want to go into this field, huh?
I think you just need
Especially
a lot
in
of
Sabah.
friends. Yeah.
SOS.
Yes. But most of the time, the native court should handle it for you lah. As the lawyer advising a client going to a native court case, you just have to help them with all the procedural bits. You've got to help them manage their timelines. Don't let them exceed the time allowed for appeal. As help them file the right borang, make sure that you can help them write their letters, native court. That's your job. You are basically a clerk.
Ah,
So it's not that hard lah. Okay, next question.
I have a question on customary fine. Sorry, Sogid. Let's just go to Sogid because that's the only thing I know.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Second. It's actually a problem. I've heard a few stories from my friends in their kampong about this man raping this child. It's a statutory rape case. So instead of reporting it for like civil matters, they just go with Sogit. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it doesn't work like that. Because statutory rape is a penal offense under the penal code.
Right.
Think about this. There's no double jeopardy between a native court order and a criminal court sentence. The person still has to go through the criminal justice system. You can't run away with just Sogit. Those situations are illegal, and the native court chiefs are actually abetting to statutory rape, which could land all of them in jail lah. Because under the penal code, you have an obligation to report all crimes. Tau. So if the native chief does not report it, then the native chief is abetting to statutory rape. Clear. That is the stance all of us have to take, and what the government takes lah. But the problem with criminal justice is that if no one reports and no one knows about it, or everyone keeps quiet about it, then it doesn't go through. That's the thing lah.
So there's not much that we can do about it. Is that?
Well, we can so we go to this issue now. If it's an offense not to report criminal matters, then why do some native chiefs don't do it? It goes to this thing now. How are native chiefs appointed? We don't have a body, a governing body like our civil courts to appoint native chiefs who have qualifications. We don't even have qualifications actually. We only have an age limit. And the native chiefs and the district chiefs are politically appointed. So because of that, you have an inconsistent selection of arbitrators in the native courts. In fact, it's even worse because they normally get fired every time there's a government change for some reason. Despite maybe having a very competent native chief or district chief, if he is considered a different political camp with the current ruling government, he'll get fired or she'll get fired. That's a main problem with the native court right now. There's no integrity in the decision making because you don't even know whether that person, the native chief, knows the adat or not. Some of them don't even know the enactment actually. They don't even know the timelines. They don't know the borang procedures. Let's take an example. The native court enactment prohibits a native chief from hearing a case where he or she has vested interest, maybe family member. That's illegal now, but it still happens because the native chiefs themselves don't read their enactment. Politically appointed, kan? That's my comment lah about it.
Mr. Jubili, I have a question about that actually.
Mm.
So if it were up to you, right, what requirements would you set for those sitting in the native court?
Oh, it should be the same requirements as for the native court of appeal advocates. Seriously, they need to know the adat. They need to at least read the enactment lah. At least we've got BM and BI versions now. You don't need to know English in the native court. Uh, but please know lah your own legislation. Um, and they need security of tenure. They can't be just kicked out just because there's a government change like that. Mm-mm. You don't even need to really be aware of the adat. You because as a native chief, you will have two village chiefs side by side to give you advice. Now you can even call on village chiefs from all over your district to give you advice. If you're Murut, native chief, and you've got two Dusun parties, then call your Dusun village chief lah to give you advice. Things like that.
Okay, yeah, that's quite insightful. I think we have time for one last question before we move on to the Q&A session. So, an easy one for you, I guess. What are your thoughts on encouraging future law graduates to become native lawyers, as it is such a niche area of law?
Oh, if you're a native, go for it. Get enrolled in your native as a native court of appeal advocate. I myself not enrolled yet, but when we get the chance, let's go. If you're a non-native, still read it up because you will get native clients. They will want to know these things. You can't run away from it lah, and don't make that mistake of dismissing the native court punya powers. Like that example I mentioned about Sabahan lawyers saying in a public forum that native marriages in the native court are not legal or not recognized. That's really, really embarrassing for all of us lah. Because as a Sabahan, you need to know the basic bits like that. So go for it. See you at the bar. We don't really have a bar actually. I think we are quite underfunded. Talk to your MP, your Adun. Get more funding. Yes, go.
I think webinars like this will also help encourage people to join the native customary law section. So okay, now that it's almost 3, I think we can close the questions from us. So thank you, Mr. Jubili, for the really insightful and stimulating discussion. Native law is definitely a very niche area of law, and it is not very well known to a lot of us. I can say that for myself. But this session has certainly shed some light on the lives of natives and how their own laws govern them in ways that are different from those of civil laws. So now is the time for our Q&A session with the audience. I will pass the time to Afini.
Hi, everybody. You're back with me, and I'll be your Q&A moderator for this afternoon. You can now type in your questions to Mr. Jubili in the chat box, and I'll ask them on your behalf. So, okay, we have a question now. Hi, may I know who stands in the Majlis Native Court bar?
Oh, those people who interview you, right? Is that the one? That would be there's actually a subsidiary legislation that tells you. Yeah, I think it's called. Let me check the Native Courts Registration of Native Court of Appeal Advocates rules. Oh yes, rules. So there are a bunch of people. Among them is the State Attorney General, the Director of the Pejabat Hal Ehwal Anak Negeri, and two district chiefs appointed. So they are normally people who know their stuff lah. They'll be the one uh, signing off your call to the native bar. Mm. But you can check. You can check. You can just go to our State Attorney General Chambers website. Sabah's website is really good. We have all our laws there. Uh, Go for it. We pay for it. It's a taxpayer thing. Go and download all the enactments. They provide very up-to-date copies of the enactment lah. Go for it.
All right, thanks, Kieran, for your question. Okay, now, next question. Do you think it is high time that Sino Kadazan KDM community or Sino natives should be issued the native certificates or Sijil Anak Negeri?
Yes, I'm confused how they've. I don't know why they continue to uh, not streamline the process of the native certificate granting. As a Sino Kadazan or Sino native, you fulfill the requirements to be a native actually. The only thing that's making their lives problematic right now is a procedural thing. And I hope we as the legal community can push for reforms lah in the procedure so that it doesn't make people's lives miserable because it really gets in the way for Sino natives this issue right now.
All right. Next question. Since the native law doesn't specify religion requirements for marriage, is it possible for a native non-Muslim to get married to a Muslim native?
Not anymore. We used to be able to do that. But I think the native court's enactment was amended many years back to invalidate that particular bit lah. Basically, as long as you're a Muslim native, matters regarding your marriage have to go under Sharia law. So that's that lah. That require if you want that situation to change, it requires policy reforms. But we used to be able to do it. Yes, the native court used to be
Not
able to
anymore.
verify these kind of marriages as long as both are natives. But now not anymore. Don't ask me why. I'm too young. But I'm
It's
sure
the
there's a
law.
political issue with it lah.
All right. Okay. Another question. In a native court of appeal, can the two district chief judgment overrule the judgment of a high court judge?
Oh, they sit as a panel, and according to the native court enactment, their decision has to be unanimous. There's no dissenting judgment in all levels of the native court.
Mhm.
Mm-mm. So I think that's why they sit in odd numbers, so they can basically outvote the
Yeah.
dissenter lah. Yeah,
Yeah.
but there's no
Alright.
dissenting judgment. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Next question. What are some other benefits for one to go to a native court instead of a civil one?
Besides it being cheap, because you don't pay civil lawyers, it's like it's really cheap, like crazy cheap. As long as you as the native are willing to go through the process lah of going to the hearing yourself, waiting for the timelines, all that things.
Is it a lengthy
It's-
process?
It can be if you end up with a native court that is a bit incompetent lah. Imagine if your case was before native chief, then suddenly Sabah has a snap election, then that native chief gets fired. So what happens to your pending case? Then you have to wait, and then you have to follow up. We have if you look if you look at our native practice and procedure regulation rules, you'll notice that it mentions the registrar of the native court. We have the position, but there's no one there. We don't have a native court registrar, even though the law allows for the registrar to be there. So without the registrar, then you get native chiefs who may or may not be very um, good at administrative matters. So yeah. So actually, there's a lot of non-benefits to the native court, but the main benefit is the cost lah, as well
Yeah.
as the adat matter.
Right, right.
Mm.
Okay, let's go to the next question. Just like civil cases, is mediation available also in native litigation cases? Yeah, this.
Yes, we have a non-government organization called Pusaka. You can Google them. They go around helping train native chiefs on mediation. It's allowed. In the native court enactment, there's a section that talks about jurisdiction of the native court to give advice and I think to facilitate negotiations or advice among the parties, so you don't have to go and fight it out lah. Mm-mm.
A question from Dylan. Do you think that there has been a decline over the years in the use of native court avenues? And what do you foresee in the future for the native law, since it has a strong ancestral roots, which has to contend with the modern world today?
Yes, there is a decline, mostly because people are starting to lose confidence in the native court due to the inconsistent quality of native chiefs. Uh, before, back when Sabah was fully one-party state, where the native chiefs were kind of permanently there, they were not changing. A lot of people preferred, were okay going to the native court, but there has been a resurgence of native marriages. Before this, a lot of people look down in the native court marriages. They prefer to go to civil marriages lah. But I'm seeing an increase of interest in native court marriages. I think because our generation are getting looking back and trying to reclaim our identities lah, our indigenous identities. I think
Stay
that's
true
why.
to their roots.
Yeah, it's true.
Right. Okay, we have another question from Dylan. Do you think the native communities in Sabah are aware of our native laws? If not, how should we go about spreading awareness? That is one of the problems also.
I think our native communities are 50-50 in being aware about their adat. I think there is a lack of awareness of how the native court works. That's the one. So substantive law, the adat, maybe, maybe not. But procedural law, the native court system, there's definitely a lack of awareness lah. We as the natives of Sabah don't really know how it works. How should we go spreading the awareness? Dylan, you should open up a YouTube channel lah, or something like that, or do some sort of like Facebook thing, and then just talk about the simple bits in the native court enactment. Like explain to them, oh, if the native chief is your uncle lah, cannot sit there actually. It should be somebody else like that. Things like this like. People don't know. People don't know that the native chiefs in the panel should have no relationship at all with the two parties. So that's how injustice happens lah. Pilih kasih, all that stuff. Yeah.
Conflict of interest.
Yeah, it's like that. Oh my god, it's conflict of interest all the time.
Yeah,
Because they don't know.
true,
Okay,
true.
go Dylan, go.
Okay, question here. Is there a lack of advocates in Native Court of Appeal since, as you mentioned, they have not called advocates as of late?
Yes,
They,
there is a lack actually. The Sabah Law Society website has a list, I think, of native court of appeal advocates, and it's really small. Uh, so that's the thing, but the issue with that is that you don't have a association like in Sabah, the SLS or the Bar Council for native lawyers and native court of appeal lawyers. It's purely a state matter, state government matter. So if it's low in the list, then that's how it is lah. So yes, there is a lack.
how many native lawyers do we have actually in Sabah? Like,
I
countable
I
by fingers.
I
Satu, dua,
actually
tiga.
don't know. It's probably on the website, I think.
All right, let's just find out later.
Yes.
Okay, move on to the next question. Aside from the aduns who legislate this law, does the Guansio
Oh no.
have any say
Yes, that fella.
in, yeah?
Uh, okay, first and foremost, the Guanxio is purely a customary title. He's like a shaman actually. He's like a bobohizan. You can say you're a Huguancio, and but you don't actually have any say. You can represent. He's like a politician with no seat. You know, he can make noise all the time. It's normally a he because the Huguancio is a title for warriors last time. So that's that lah. I mean, and also he's a Huguancio for a certain number of ethnics, ja. So I think if you're like Sungai, he's not your Huguancio because Sungai people don't have Huguancios. Maybe Murut people don't have Huguancios. So they don't have a say.
Mhm. It's like, it's just a figure there to. It's just a figure.
Yeah, it's just a figure. It's an ethnic group says, "Oh, this fella is our supreme warrior." So we kind of respect his words lah. But then that's it lah. It's just a
Ah, I see.
ceremonial thing.
All right, I think that is all for today's Q&A session. Thank you all for your interesting questions. We've learned a
Yeah.
lot. We've learned a lot, and yeah, back to you, Amber.
Okay, thank you, Afini, and thank you for everyone for sending in your questions, and also, of course, Mr. Jubili for answering them so carefully and thoughtfully. I would first like to thank everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us in the very first session of this webinar series. There's more to come in the weeks ahead. So we hope that the wisdom imparted by Mr. Jubili has been eye-opening for those in attendance. And it definitely has
Wisdom.
for me. Yeah, it is wisdom though. So with that, I hope to see all of you in our upcoming sessions. In the meantime, take care and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.